At last we have reached the point of the semester where we are reading Harry Potter, the school story most of you knew before you took this class. When you first read the book, probably as a kid, you most likely didn't know that it is only a late installment in a genre that has existed for hundreds of years. In many ways, Harry Potter is just Tom Brown with magic. Some other added components are the orphan's Bildungsroman, and of course the Christian or heroic meta-narrative, in which Harry will end up sacrificing himself in order to save the world from Voldemort. A Bildungsroman is a novel of development, which is to say a novel that shows what influences turn an adolescent into an adult. All school stories have a little of this element, but since they are so often focused on formulaic incidents, we don't usually classify them that way. Let's think for a minute about things we can find in Harry Potter that remind us of school stories. Though we're only reading one book in this class, I'll assume you know the whole arc of the story. If not, look it up on Wikipedia. Very obviously, Harry Potter follows a formula. Each book begins in summer vacation. Then the school year begins. Lessons, vacations, and exams ensue, and the story ends with the end of the school year. This is true even for the final book, where Harry, Ron, and Hermione don't return to school, but are keenly aware of the school year happening in the background. I'm sure that formula seems familiar to you from The Magnet. Since The Magnet was a weekly periodical, it featured Christmas stories at Christmas time, vacation stories during school holidays, and so on. Harry Potter also includes some of the tropes of the school story, such as sports. It doesn't really matter whether the sport is cricket, football, or Quidditch. The only thing that matters is that the story's hero is good at sport, and that sport helps to reveal boys' character. Class is a clear concern of Harry Potter. We get that in two veins. First, Harry's existence in the closet at his aunt and uncle's middle-class house places him in either a low social class or possibly just outside of class completely. He doesn't have money of his own to spend. He has to wear Dudley's ill-fitting hand-me-down clothes, and at the zoo his uncle buys him a cheap lemon ice lolly, while Dudley and his friend Piers get large chocolate ice creams. Meanwhile, Harry's aunt and uncle are obsessed with projecting their class to the neighbors through signifiers including their perfectly green manicured lawn and their new car. Second, once Harry's real antecedents are revealed, he discovers that he is very wealthy. Not perhaps as wealthy as the Malfoys with their manor, but with more money than he can spend easily. He's also a member of an old wizarding family on his father's side, though of course his mother was Muggle-born. This allows Harry to see class from both sides of the divide. With the Dursleys, he can't acquire the things other kids have that would make him fit in and feel normal. At Hogwarts, he can dispense largesse to his friends, such as when he provides the candy feast for Ron on the train. Class is somewhat different in Britain than in America. British class structures are fairly rigid, so that studies of surnames that can be traced back to William the Conqueror's retainers from 1066 show their descendants are still among the most privileged members of British society. But at the same time, Britons can actually see and therefore talk about class divides in a way that Americans can't. We're big fans of pretending we're all middle class, no matter how much money we have. Harry Potter also includes some scenes of learning. I'm really interested in the classroom scenes because they show how strong is the notion that all students are bored by class. At Hogwarts, students are learning how to make teacups fly about the room and turn hedgehogs into pincushions, but their classes are still generally boring to the students. The exception, of course, is Hermione, who in Victorian school stories would have been called a swot. When Harry first gets his school books, he is excited to read them and find out about the magical world he didn't know existed. The narrator tells us that his school books were very interesting. He lay on his bed reading late into the night. But it isn't long before Hermione is saying, "Honestly, Harry, didn't you read Hogwarts, a history?" So just as with the Victorian schoolboys bored by Latin and looking for cribs to help them translate Caesar, Harry is a middling student. There's an apparent problem for the writer in this scenario. For Rowling, it only makes sense to acknowledge that schoolbooks that teach students how to do spells or that tell tales of magical adventures would be fascinating to read. But in her day, as in the Victorian era, schoolchildren who are too interested in studying are like Hermione, kind of unlikable to other children. And so, to make Harry normal and relatable to child readers, Rowling has to reassure us that he's not really that into school. Of course, scenes of learning may involve conflict with teachers. Hogwarts uses non-physical punishments, such as detention and gating, but it also uses a merit-demerit system that largely replaced corporal punishment in public schools by the time the novel was written. The idea was that students would be so loyal to their houses, an idea both mocked and upheld in Stalky, that they would try very hard to add points to their house's total and avoid detracting from it. Just as in Tom Brown and Stalky, students at Hogwarts are assigned houses, but unlike those books, Hogwarts students are assigned based on personal qualities such as bravery or intelligence. It's interesting to think about how this might change the whole house loyalty theme. When Tom shows up at rugby, he is assigned to schoolhouse for no reason other than that there is a bed available there. Nevertheless, he immediately decides, based partly on the information of his new friend East, that schoolhouse is the best house at rugby, and he happily nearly dies maintaining the honor of his house in his first rugby football match. At the Call, houses are named by their masters, and Stalky, Beetle, and Maturk don't feel much loyalty to their house until they are insulted by boys from another house, a situation that leads to the events of an unsavory interlude. But Harry knows before the sorting hat is put on his head that he doesn't want to end up in Slytherin, and from Hagrid's communications while they are shopping, he already thinks of Gryffindor as the best house because his parents have been there. Which house you end up in at Hogwarts seems to have a great deal of influence on the rest of your life. Everyone who has ever gone bad had been assigned to Slytherin, and all the great heroes of Hogwarts seem to come from Gryffindor. I think the idea that the sorting hat places you in a house according to your sometimes secret internal qualities probably has a lot to do with how quickly first-year students at Hogwarts develop not just loyalty to their house, but the sense that their house is the best. Because we know the history of the school story now, there is much that is familiar in Harry Potter. I bet you can name even more school story tropes than appear in the book. But because school stories became less popular during the early part of the 20th century, disappearing completely after the Second World War when paper shortages caused a number of publications like the Magnet to stop publishing, the format of the school story as a genre of fiction had fallen out of readers' consciousness by the time Harry Potter appeared in 1997. Your forum this week will ask you to identify ways that Harry Potter reminds you of other school stories we have read this semester, and also to think about how the different social environment at the end of the 20th century created changes in the generic conventions Rowling deploys. How do you think the familiar contours of the school story helped Rowling introduce the fantastic elements that are part of all stories about magic? How does magic shape and reform the school story?